I'm Bob Berdahl, and I have the pleasure of being Chancellor of this university and also the great pleasure of introducing this program tonight, a lively rematch of the debate between Christopher Hitchens, contributing editor at Vanity Fair and former I.F. Stone Fellow at the Journalism School, and Mark Danner, professor at the Journalism School and staff writer for The New Yorker. The debate tonight is sponsored by the Goldman Forum on Press and Foreign Affairs. This series of lectures, dialogues, scholarships that it provides is meant to foster debate on how critical world issues are covered in the American media and how they can be covered more effectively. We're very grateful for the support of Richard Goldman, one of the university's major benefactors and friends. Our hosts tonight are the Berkeley School of Journalism and the World Affairs Council of Northern California. I will introduce in a moment Orville Schell, who will provide the ground rules for tonight's debate. But let me first introduce our speakers. Christopher Hitchens contributes an essay on books each month to the Atlantic Monthly. He is the author of more than 10 books, and most recently, A Long Short War, The Postponed Liberation of Iraq. He's a contributing editor to Vanity Fair, has written for many American and English periodicals, including The Nation, the London Review of Books, the Los Angeles Times Book Review, Slate, the New York Review of Books, Newsweek, the Times Literary Supplement, and the Washington Post. Hitchens began his career in England in the 1970s as a writer for the New Statesman and the Evening Standard. From 1977 to 79, he worked for London's Daily Express as a foreign correspondent and then returned to the New Statesman as foreign editor, where he worked from 79 to 81. Hitchens has also served as the Washington editor for Harper's and as the U.S. correspondent for The Spectator and the Times Literary Supplement. From 1986 to 92, he was the book review critic at the New York Newsday. He's also been visiting professor at Berkeley, as I've indicated, at the University of Pittsburgh and the New School for Social Research. Mark Danner, a professor at the Graduate School of Journalism and staff writer for The New Yorker, has just returned from a reporting trip to Baghdad. He has written extensively on Haiti, Central America, the Balkans, and the development of American foreign policy in Europe and the Middle East. Danner joined the New Yorker's staff in April of 1990, 5 months after the magazine published his three-part series on Haiti, A Reporter at Large Beyond the Mountains, which won the 1990 National Magazine Award for reporting. On December 6, 1993, for the second time in its history, The New Yorker devoted its entire issue to one article, Danner's piece on an investigation into the notorious massacre in a remote Salvadorian town. He won an Overseas Press Club Award and other awards for this work. Danner's book on the massacre was published in 1994 and was recognized by the New York Times Book Review as one of the notable books of the year. Danner's study of Haiti, Beyond the Mountains, The Legacy of Duvalier, is forthcoming from Metropolitan Books. As you can see, we have much expertise to draw on tonight, and I want to thank you all in advance for your attendance. This promises to be an extraordinarily interesting and lively debate. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce the Dean of the School of Journalism, Orville Schell, who will provide us with the ground rules for the discussion. Orville.
Well, thank you. It's great to see you all here. I think some testament to the fact that this is an important moment in the history of this country, if not the world. Indeed, I think it is something of a tipping point moment as our country finds itself in a war which it hadn't anticipated being as difficult as it is. And as we find the nation, I think, increasingly polarized around what we have done and what we might do. I think if we are to really try to find a reasonable balance sheet for where we are, there really is no better format than a debate. I think we're all rather weary of hearing people yell at each other on television. There's something reassuring about a formal debate where people actually have a chance to say what they mean, disagree with each other, and then challenge each other. I think the proposition that we are here to debate tonight is the following, and I quote President Bush: "I will defend my record at the appropriate time and look forward to it. I'll say that the world is more peaceful and more free under my leadership, and that America is more secure. That will be how I will begin describing our foreign policy." And in effect, I think this is what we are going to be discussing here tonight. I want to read one other quote, sort of by way of setting the backdrop for this debate. It goes like this: "Trying to eliminate Saddam would have incurred incalculable human and political costs. Apprehending him was probably impossible. We would have been forced to occupy Baghdad and, in effect, rule Iraq. There was no viable exit strategy we could see, violating another of our principles. Going in and occupying Iraq, thus unilaterally exceeding the United Nations mandate, would have destroyed the precedent of international response to aggression that we hope to establish. Had we gone the invasion route, the United States could conceivably still be an occupying power in a bitterly and hostile land." That was uttered by the current president's father, and I think does suggest that even within a single family, it is possible to have widely differing views, whatever the president's father may currently think. Now, let me end here with an admonishment to you all. I ask you all to be civil, to be decorous. You will agree with one of these people or the other, that is certain. But please give both full measure of your attention without interruption. The format of the debate will be 10-minute statements. These will be followed by 7-minute rebuttals, then counter rebuttals, and then finally 5-minute closes. We will then have questions from the audience. There are 2 microphones in the aisles. I urge you not to line up until I give the signal, or we may have people standing for a very long time. I also urge you, please no speeches. If you begin to deliver a long and windy speech, you will be cut off. Your question should be 30 seconds or less, succinct and to the point. We will also ask the debaters to limit their answers to 2 minutes so that they will be equally as succinct and to the point. So let us begin. Mark and Christopher, please come forward. Mark will be here, and Christopher here. Now, to decide who goes first, we will flip a coin. Hitchens, you were heads. Danner, you were tails, and you will have... Who decided that? We'll discuss that later.
Quis custodiet.
All right. It's heads. Hitchens, your choice.
Oh, I can choose which?
Go first or second?
I'll go first.
To your position.
Thank you. If you don't mind. No. And it's made easier for me, ladies and gentlemen, and also gives me the opportunity to be brief, as well as releasing you from any vows of civility or courtesy you may have involuntarily taken.
Christopher, before you begin, may I say, there is a sign here, a 1-minute warning.
Very good.
So please observe.
I hope not to need it. The Dean, my valued colleague and comrade Orwell, has spared me my introductory paragraph, which I recently combed from the memoirs of George Bush and Brent Scowcroft, by reading it out to you himself. I think I'll just review it again in its entirety, though, to give you the full horror of Chapter 19 of A World Transformed, the work of President Bush Sr. and General Brent Scowcroft, because Orwell not unnaturally condensed it slightly. It's a dense paragraph of apparent prescience, first published in 1998. Trying to eliminate Saddam, extending the ground war into an occupation of Iraq, would have violated our guideline about not changing objectives in midstream, engaging in mission creep, and incurred incalculable human and political costs. Apprehending him was probably impossible. we had been unable to find Noriega in Panama, which we knew intimately, we would have been forced to occupy Baghdad and, in effect, rule Iraq. Going in and occupying Iraq, thus unilaterally exceeding the UN mandate, would have destroyed the precedent of international response to aggression that we hoped to establish. And had we gone the invasion route, the United States could conceivably still be an occupying power in a bitterly hostile land. Now, if you make the relevant allowances of differences of emphasis and of confusion that I think is possibly willful here about the historical record, because after all, it was on the Bush-Scowcroft watch that Manuel Noriega was successfully apprehended. So pessimistic are they, in fact, in this account, that they fail to register one of their own successes. One could not, I think, have a better paraphrase of what is an emerging left-right conventional wisdom, extending all the way from Pat Buchanan to General Clark. And like its more recent emulators, it has another thing in common. It represents the anti-Saddam war, or the campaign for regime change in Iraq, or the American invasion of Iraq, or the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq, or whatever you choose to call it. It represents that outcome as something not other than elective, something that was voluntary, that was voulu, rather than as I will maintain, and shall maintain, and have maintained all along, something inescapable, unpostponable, ineluctable. It's also, if you care to notice, and some of you will, the exact same logic that was also employed by President Bush and General Scowcroft and many others to justify their policy of staying out of Bosnia, Herzegovina, staying out of Kosovo, and in general of deciding to let the Balkans run, as they did, rather than to intervene. So it's an argument with a long history that's not as glorious as its apparent prescience, prudence, or common sense may make it sound. That's not to say that I haven't noticed another thing about the present debate, which is a slightly distressing tendency by those who support the intervention of resting their case largely on the underreported good news. Like Mark, I've been in Iraq myself since we last met, and I certainly wouldn't deny, and I'm fond of asserting, that there's a great deal to celebrate in the new Iraq. The restoration of the ecology of the southern marshes, for example, the largest wetlands in the Middle East, the home of the Marsh Arabs, the emancipation of the media, and the consequent enormous burgeoning of electronic and print revolution, the emancipation of the schools and universities, the consolidation of Kurdish autonomy, the opening of the mass graves and the secret prisons. All of these are magnificent things, but those who want to take credit for them must, of course, by an axiom, automatically accept the blame for the huge lacunae in matters such as water or power or security that go along with this success. And in my view, if one is prepared to support a cause, one must be prepared to support it when it is going badly. The president's been widely lampooned by many a glib columnist, Ms. Dowd most notably, for saying that increased violence isn't necessarily a cause for despair or alarm, and may even be evidence of traction. Actually, he's quite right to take this apparently paradoxical view. Paradox is not the president's strong point, and his first venture into it was somewhat tentative. And to my knowledge, actually, and in my hearing, that view was first expressed by General John Abizade, a very seasoned soldier in many theaters of war and revolution. But I will say that I think it's correct to diagnose that those who murder the officials of the United Nations, including our beloved former friend Sergio de Mello, the man who oversaw the independence and shamefully belated freedom of East Timor, and those who murder the officials of the Red Cross, and who blow up the Jordanian embassy, and set fire to oil pipelines, and blow up water mains, and shoot down respected Muslim clerics outside places of worship, are making our point for us. And their desperation is an accurate guide. There's no justifiable way that a country as populous and important as Iraq can possibly be left at the mercy of such people, and I would argue, have always argued, that there never was any justification for leaving Iraq the prisoner of such people. So the counsel of prudence espoused by Bush and Scowcroft and their new liberal emulators is a sort of pseudo-realism. It's not as practical or as hard-headed or as prudent as it purports to be. Even in the year when it was instated, when it was decided to go no further in the quarrel with Saddam Hussein, it did have a number of very obvious disadvantages. Number one, it left Saddam Hussein, a psychopathic sadist and megalomaniac, in sole charge of Iraq and its people. It left the Iraqi people under United Nations sanctions, which the regime itself could mostly evade, but which very greatly punished the population, and seems to have had a very degrading effect on society and its infrastructure. It did, as its authors, Bush and Scowcroft elsewhere, are forced to concede, involve the United States in watching from the sidelines as Iraqis who'd taken America's word and encouragement were mown down from the air in hundreds of thousands for rebelling on America's side and in its name. It left the Ba'athist regime free to continue work on weapons of mass destruction, which we know for certain that that regime was doing on a very grand scale until at the very least 1995. It left Saddam Hussein free to threaten his neighbors and to give support to jihad forces all around the world. The man most wanted, for example, in the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center in New York, a man called Musab Yassin, fled straight from New Jersey to Baghdad, though there are still those in our intelligence services who prefer to grant Saddam Hussein the presumption of innocence in this and in several other matters. It also left Saddam Hussein free to try and assassinate former President Bush on his post-war visit to Kuwait, an act of such transparent lunacy that it far transcends any sneers, I think, about the present president wanting to avenge his daddy. It also demonstrates something else of importance, by the way, Saddam Hussein's urgent personal need for a revenge for his defeat in Kuwait in 1991. And that's a consideration that I believe deserves more attention than it's received. So this already lousy status quo wasn't really a status quo. It was, as you can see easily, very volatile and highly unstable. Saddam Hussein's speeches were becoming ever more demented, ever more extreme, and ever more Islamist in their tone. The flag of Iraq was amended to include a very threatening verse from the Quran. Gigantic mosques were being built in Saddam Hussein's name. He financed openly the suicide murderers in Palestine, whose avowed objective is the establishment of a theocratic dictatorship over all, whether believers or not believers. And even if, as seems remotely possible, it's a contingency that may be taken seriously, Saddam Hussein was, after 95, 98, largely bluffing about WMDs, that conclusion on its own would completely destroy the view maintained by very many liberals that for all his many crimes, Saddam at least understood the basic logic of deterrence and self-preservation. The saying was, if you remember, that he was in his box. Not a bit of it. Not only was he able to defy the UN, but with French and Russian collusion, he was increasingly able to circumvent the sanctions. The box was falling apart. Its supposed loony captive was becoming ever more toxic and uncontainable. And as he became older and crazier, there emerged the real prospect, the very clear prospect, of a succession, passing to either Uday or to Qusay Hussein, or perhaps, if we were really lucky and the Iraqi people were well behaved enough, to both of them. Who wants to review the prospect of an Uday Qusay Hussein Iraq with equanimity? Who wants to see how that would pan out? 1 minute? Very well. Prepare for a rhetorical acceleration. Look, I'm glad we've got a bit of rebuttal. I'll be, if I haven't got my drift across by now, I won't have done at all. But the question, in other words, becomes this. Should the date or the timing of this unpostponable confrontation have been left to Saddam Hussein to pick? Or was it for those responsible forces in the international community to save Iraq from the undoubted traumatic implosion that was coming anyway, that was in our future, the meltdown of Iraqi society, the possibility of Sunni, Shia, Kurdish civil war, the possibility of organized crime taking over the cities, the certainty that there would have been opportunistic interventions from outside, certainly from Turkey, probably from Iran. All of these things were going to happen. All of them are a great deal more menacing, would have been a great deal more menacing than the relatively contained and I would say unquestionably liberating effect of a preemptive, well-thought-out intervention. Seriousness about inspections demanded, as David... Sorry? Yeah. I'm willing to stop on a dime to respect the... I'll just have to close and say that for these reasons and others which I will share with you, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, at the appropriate time. I suspect the counsel of prudence that I opened with, regard it as pseudo-realistic, as I regard its authors of being, and suspect even more the tendency of much of today's left to take its refuge in a neutralist and conservative isolationism. Thanks and bye for now.
Mark Danner, 10 minutes.
Gosh, that was good. You know, I feel saddened that I have to point out the distance of those beautiful remarks from the truth of what's going on the ground. It feels like, I don't know, willfully destroying a masterpiece somehow. Our subject tonight is, has Bush made us safer? I'm going to begin, before I take up some of what Christopher had to say, with an attempt to answer that question. And I ask all of you sitting in the hall to think about it in personal terms. Has Bush made me safer? My answer, in personal terms, is no. He hasn't. My answer would be that Bush has made us less safe. Bush has made us less safe because he willfully ignored what he heard from the Clinton administration about terrorism and about its preeminence as a threat to the United States. And the new administration preferred to focus on missile defense. George Bush made us less safe, or has left us less safe, because the president responded to an attack on Washington and New York by invading Afghanistan and then leaving it as insecure as he found it, letting al-Qaeda and the Taliban flow back into a vacuum that U.S. forces left. George Bush has made us less safe because he started a preemptive war with Iraq that did not have to be fought, that, despite everything Christopher just said, was not necessary, was not forced upon the United States. And though he concluded military action quickly, the war has gotten steadily worse. Since Christopher and I met last in Berkeley, 9 months ago, more than 350 Americans are dead. More than 2,000 are wounded, many of them grievously wounded. About 10,000, somewhere between 10 and 20,000 Iraqis are dead. And the war, as I can testify from personal experience over the last couple of weeks, is getting worse. These are facts. When I arrived in Baghdad about 3 weeks ago, there were an average every day of 15 attacks on American forces. When I left, the average had gone up to nearly 35. Every day, 1, 2, 3 Americans are being killed in Iraq. And for all the talk about the fact that 80% of the country, 60% of the country, 95% of the country is perfectly fine and pacified, in fact, the area in which fighting is going on, in which Americans and Iraqis are being killed, is steadily broadening. Since major combat was declared over, the situation has steadily gotten worse, and over the last 2 weeks, it has gotten dramatically worse. And on the evidence I saw, and the people I spoke to, which included a number of senior generals, very, very able people, very intelligent people, with all of the technological resources of the United States of America at their command, my impression at the end of a lot of talk, a lot of interviews, many of them off the record, was that the American military is completely at sea. They don't know how to fight what is a growing insurgency. Bush has made us less safe because he has debilitated the main arm of defense against terrorism, and that is the United States intelligence agencies, which are now fighting in full-throated anger against the administration. You have a CIA battle against the White House as we sit here in this hall, which will, as the election approaches, get worse. Now, Christopher has just made an argument that all this was completely necessary. He argues that Saddam Hussein was strong, erratic, would have gained in weapons and power, and indeed would have reached the point where he would have handed over power to his admittedly quite disgusting progeny. He also argues that the Iraqi regime was getting weaker and was about to implode, and that such an implosion would have inevitably drawn in the neighbors of Iraq and into a situation in which the United States would be forced to intervene. I'll leave it to you to decide whether these two arguments cited in quick succession make sense next to one another. It seems to me he was either getting stronger or he was getting weaker. You can ponder that question, noble audience. And we can, for a moment, go back 9 months to the last time we appeared together in Berkeley. As I recall, Christopher argued very vehemently that the United States was under imminent threat from weapons of mass destruction, that those weapons were being hidden, that the inspectors who were sent by the United Nations to find them were thoroughly incapable of doing so, that indeed a nuclear weapon could be produced by the Iraqi regime in relatively short order, that the United States indeed was forced, under the shadow of these threats, to intervene. We have since found out that much of what we heard from the administration in making this argument was false. We know much of the intelligence information was, how should we put it, crooked, exaggerated, manipulated. We've heard this from leaks from within the administration, and particularly from the CIA, and we have seen it with our own eyes. Donald Rumsfeld said, "We know where these weapons are." Condoleezza Rice said, "This threat may become a mushroom cloud." All of these things were false. That doesn't necessarily constitute a decisive argument for not going to war with Iraq. It should leave us as citizens somewhat skeptical of the arguments now put forward by those who argued these things a mere few months ago. The citizens of the United States were essentially swindled into supporting a war that was not necessary. They were swindled into supporting a war that is getting more serious, more difficult by the day. They were told that an imminent threat had to be confronted. And in fact, I would argue, the country has become involved in a war that will end up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. It was a war against terror. Well, you have a situation on the ground where more and more jihadists are coming over what are now fairly open borders into Iraq. Were we worried at the time that Iraqis would be killing Americans? Well, they are doing so right now. Were we worried there would be more suicide bombing? Well, we see it on our television screens every day. Are we hearing arguments, as Christopher so delightfully put it in characterizing George Bush's talent for paradox, that these attacks show us quite simply that the opponent is becoming more desperate? Well, that's a fascinating argument. I guess it would lead us to believe that when the attacks stop, that is the time to really worry. I was in Baghdad the other day heading for an interview when my car was nearly thrown off the road by an enormous explosion. I was about a block away from the Red Cross. When I arrived, I was the first journalist there, one of the first people there. I found a scene of really indescribable horror. Flames 12, 13 feet high, curtain of black, dense black smoke, bodies everywhere. And this was the first of 4 suicide bombings that day. these were not going on 9 months ago in Iraq. The attacks on Americans, needless to say, were not going on 9 months ago in Iraq. There has been no proof of an imminent threat that was posed to Americans by Saddam Hussein. There is proof that the United States, having undertaken this foolish war, has increased the risk to American citizens, to America's young people who are now there dying every day and increasingly bewildered why they are there dying every day, and increased the risk to us. Because, as I predicted 9 months ago, Iraq could easily be made into an area for al-Qaeda to build its support and to increase its political backing in the world, in the Middle East especially. The United States has managed in the last 9 months to create exactly that. Bush has not made us safer.
Seven minutes for rebuttal. Hitchens?
Bill Clinton did actually make a speech on the steps of the Pentagon in 1998, which I can give anyone a copy of if they wish, saying that there was no escaping the fact that there would have to be a war with Saddam Hussein one day. It is the speech that is given out by every neoconservative organization in Washington as the classic statement of what American foreign policy priorities were then and should have been. That Mr. Clinton didn't do anything about it and needn't necessarily be held to his charge. He didn't do that much about al-Qaeda either, except for bombing the wrong target in Sudan, lying about it, letting Osama bin Laden get away while looking better, and pursuing a Nobel Peace Prize for a futile Oslo process. If you don't believe that, you might be willing to believe that Afghanistan is less safe now, I think I quote Mark Tanner correctly, less safe now than it was when the Taliban was in power and it was the hinterland country for al-Qaeda. This is Afghanistan which for the first time in a very long time has its women folk going to school, is promulgating a constitution that was published yesterday, is building a road system between Kandahar and Kabul. It's the roads that allow warlordism, ladies and gentlemen. A warlord is someone who controls a stretch of non-highway road, and which has largely expelled and is killing every day members of the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban militia. To say that we're less safe there would be the equivalent of saying that we were safer from Al-Qaeda before September 11th, 2001, when unknown to us, but apparently known to our vaunted intelligence services, which have suffered so grievously from the Bush administration, known to the CIA and the FBI, though not passed on to one another or to the civilian leadership, was the fact that a secret army was being formed inside our borders with support from foreign regimes. That was known then. It just wasn't considered to be worthy of any serious action. The security we enjoyed when al-Qaeda and the Taliban controlled Afghanistan and Saddam Hussein controlled Iraq, when it must be admitted fewer Americans were then being killed and there was less violence, was the security of a fool's paradise. Is there anyone who thinks that we have not been for some time at war with the forces of jihad and the totalitarian states that underwrite them? Is there anyone who really thinks that the relationship between the Ba'ath Party and the Fedayeen Saddam and the jihadists who are now coming into Iraq or re-entering Kurdistan began only when the United States intervened? Nobody who studied the question could believe this for a second. The Ansar al-Islam group formed in Kurdistan under Saddam's protection. The subventions of money and propaganda support to jihad forces all around the world were an increasingly conspicuous feature of the Ba'athist regime. And as for inspections, I'd refer you to the work of Dr. David Kelly, a very distinguished former British arms inspector, whose regrettable suicide has embarrassed the Blair government so much, and to an article he wrote, only just published, alas, just before his death, saying that anyone who wanted inspections in Iraq had to be for regime change, because without a regime change there could be no verification, a perfectly commonsensical point. Now Iraq has been disarmed and hasn't yet been fully inspected, but is being inspected at last. And everyone is saying that they're resentful and surly about this extraordinary outcome. An outcome that, I will remind you, has forced the Iranian mullahs to accept mediation from at least two foreign ministers who wouldn't have bothered with it before, Monsieur de Villepin and Mr. Fisher, in alliance with Jack Straw, has forced them to accept mediation, United Nations supervision, and inspection. Does anybody believe that the mullahs in Iran would be consenting to this level of intervention in their covert nuclear program if it were not, one, for the fact that the rival, the deadly enemy against whom they built this weaponry, has been removed and disarmed, first, and second, that a fairly useful pedagogic example has been afforded them of what will happen in case of defiance, that if they bluff, they will be taken seriously. Who objects to that? Who would feel safer if they'd gone on developing their program and lying about it as they were doing until a couple of months ago? If we have to refer this matter, as under the rubric of this meeting, not known to me today actually, until today, but never mind, the slightly fatuous rubric of our own self-regard and our own safety, never mind, take it at its own face value. Yes, you are safer for the disarmament of Iraq. Yes, you are safer for the coming disarmament of Iran. Yes, you are safer for the physical destruction of the Taliban bin Laden regime in Kabul. And yes, you have President Bush to thank for it, and not President Clinton, and not George Tenet, and not the FBI, all of whom allowed these developments to occur and left us defenseless in our own hometowns under open skies. Now, the David Kay inquiry, the reports of which seem to me to be printed completely upside down. They said, David Kay discovers no shelves with neatly arranged stockpiles of weaponry. What does the David Kay report actually say? I trust everyone here has read at least some of it before coming along. The David Kay report finds first evidence of an enormous and consistent concealment program. Call me old-fashioned if you will. By my logic of induction, a concealment program is evidence in itself. No one has a concealment program to conceal nothing. Scientists were threatened, 2 of them were shot for even considering cooperation with the earlier inspectors. Not that I think the Blix team was really looking, but in case they were looking, scientists were shot and intimidated and their families threatened with extermination if they cooperated. Designs and plans for missiles have been found by the K team, who are only a quarter of their way into their work, that far exceed, by thousands of miles, the limits that Saddam Hussein was allowed for the range of his missiles. Toxins have been found concealed in the private homes of scientists, in one case buried in a garden. It's quite extraordinary how far the depravity of the Saddam Hussein regime has been exposed in this matter of weapons of mass destruction by the Kay report. That was my 1 minute. I don't need another one.
Seven minutes, Mark Danner.
I think we're all faced with a question here, which is, are we citizens or are we dupes? Do we have the ability to make distinctions? Can we read the newspaper, listen to the news, listen to our leaders speak to us, and make judgments on our own? The evidence of the last few months gives us some pause, it seems to me, when we consider these questions. Christopher is clearly one of the 69% of Americans who the Washington Post claims believe that Saddam was behind 9/11.
If I had thought that, I would have said so. And I did have a spare minute.
Well, I would have been grateful if you had said it explicitly.
Then I would have had time for that too.
Well, I shall say it for you in any event. You know, George Bush, a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I think, actually came out after a particularly egregious performance by his vice president on one of the network shows, and came out and said, no, we have no evidence that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11. I found this fascinating, that he felt himself obliged to say this, because, of course, the administration, over months and months, of very clever statements, very clever terminology, very cleverly dancing around the issue, was able to convince the great majority of Americans that, in fact, these two threats were the same thing. These Americans who were shocked by 9/11, as everyone was, who thought, here are our fellow citizens being killed while they're having their morning coffee, were perfectly willing to support a war against Iraq that they felt was replying to that immediate threat. Now, this kind of clever obfuscation is still being employed every day. We've seen a little of it from this stage. The fact is, when Christopher says Saddam was disarmed, Saddam wasn't disarmed. These weapons have not been found. I'll tell you another way that Saddam has not been disarmed. All across Iraq today, there are scores of enormous fields, the size of 1, 2, 3 football fields, filled with conventional weapons. Now, up till last March, these fields were guarded by soldiers, Iraqi soldiers. Now they're not guarded by anyone. No Iraqi soldiers because the army, in America's wisdom, was dissolved. No American soldiers because there aren't enough of them in country to do it. If you like, you can drive up to one of these depots with a pickup truck or something larger, pick up as many missiles as you like. That one that shot down the helicopter the other day, a day in which, by the way, I flew out of Baghdad on a conventional plane, that missile was probably simply picked up at an arms depot that isn't being guarded. This was a war to prevent weapons from getting in the hands of terrorists. Well, suddenly we have this enormous supply of weapons, perhaps 1 million tons, which is almost as many as exist in the United States, completely open for the picking. Completely open. Now, Christopher is making a lot of arguments about, in fact, imminent threat. In fact, many of his arguments essentially rely on the perception that Saddam and al-Qaeda were essentially the same. They're not. They're not. They weren't the same. And the arguments made for supporting the war were misleading, obfuscatory, if you put it that way, and relied on premises that have since been disproven. Saddam attacks his neighbors twice. Well, the Iranian war, America supported Saddam in attacking his neighbor. 10 years later, can we use that as a reason to attack him? Saddam gassed his citizens. He did, indeed, and the United States supported him during that time. Does that mean Saddam is not a threat? Not necessarily. It does mean that when you hear people making these arguments, you should reach for your wallet and make sure it's still in your pocket. You know, we're having an argument tonight, or a discussion that seems to have to do with national security, but it only marginally has to do with national security. What it has to do with is national integrity. Whether we as a democracy can make decisions based on facts, based on how the world actually is, whether we can make judgments about our security, what makes us safer and what makes us less safe, and can do it in a competent, judicious way, without our leaders misleading us. It seems to me from this stage we're seeing another example of such misleading. Before I left my house tonight, I looked at the current state of the New York Times and saw something that had just been posted. Blasts shake U.S. headquarters in Baghdad, injuring 4. 3 powerful explosions shook central Baghdad this evening in an apparent mortar attack on the headquarters of the American civilian authorities here. The explosions in rapid succession hit what appeared to be the sprawling American compound at about 7:45 local time. Spokesman said 4 people had been injured, but otherwise gave no details. Iraqi witnesses said they saw mortar fire from the Baghdad neighborhood attacking American headquarters. They're getting desperate. They're getting more and more desperate. They're now attacking American headquarters in Baghdad. The question is the threat from Iraq now less than it was when this war was begun by the Bush administration? Are Americans more or less in danger now than they were then? Christopher would tell you that things were about to fall apart. Saddam was getting stronger, Saddam was getting weaker, Iraq was getting stronger, Iraq was about to fall apart. One way or another, America had to invade. I ask you to look at the facts. Look at your newspapers every day. You want to talk about Al-Qaeda, the terrorist threat? They're now in Iraq. They were claimed to be beforehand. They're there now. You just have to watch the network news every night and see how desperate they're becoming.
Seven minutes for Hitchens.
Well, I decided to become a journalist in part because I didn't want to have to rely on the newspapers. And I'm still very sorry for people for whom that is their source of news. I think I can decently maintain that the George Bush School of Paradox, as updated by Mark to try and catch me in saying that the Saddam Hussein regime was A, getting much worse, and B, getting more unstable, is not in fact a contradiction. Both things could be true, and both things would have been true, and the eventual implosion of the society and the state would have been the more gruesome and bloody as a result, and if it was unsupervised by the international community, even more bloody still. The obfuscation perpetrated by the Bush regime to convince 68% of the population that Saddam Hussein was behind the 9/11 attacks must have been as clever as Mark says it was, since the administration never in fact made that claim, and has never made it, and has repeatedly repudiated it.
That's my point exactly.
This is quite a scale of obfuscation. It might argue for a certain amount of credulity on the part of the American public, but that, as I say, could also be to do with the newspapers that they are or are not reading. That there is a connection between Saddamism and jihadism, I think, need not be doubted. Cannot, in fact, be doubted. It was openly promoted and promulgated by the Iraqi regime. I stress again, the Ansar al-Islam group, a directly bin Ladenist group sponsored by them in Kurdistan, the support for the suicide murderers in Palestine, the support for jihad as a rhetoric, and, perhaps not negligible entirely, the consistent support by Osama bin Laden of the Ba'ath Party's rule in Iraq and his definition of it as the front line in the struggle against American imperialism, which, allowance made for rhetorical excess, he was correct in saying, yes, it is going to be a frontline state in this war. I'm not in favor of crying before we have been seriously hurt. The 87 billion hasn't kicked in yet. The United States has absolute military superiority in Iraq. To listen to Mark Downey, you would think we were on the verge of a military defeat in a war that quite simply cannot be lost, for the sake not just of the Iraqis, but of ourselves. The war's barely begun. I'm not in favor of the raising of any white flag at this point. Now, I may add on the matter of obfuscation and misapprehension about responsibility here, that though the Bush regime did not say, has never said that Saddam Hussein was directly behind 9/11, the flagship magazine of the peace movement, my former employers of the nation, are the publishers of a very widely sold and distributed book by Gore Vidal, which says that George Bush was the man behind 9/11. Now, fortunately, 68% of the American people are not so bloody stupid as to believe that. But perhaps 70% of the peace movement, judging by the meetings I've attended and discussions I've heard and emails I get, are fully up for considering that as the root cause of our ills. Let's be clear what we're talking about, and let's not be flippant about matters of security. There was and there is a Hitler-Stalin pact between the forces of jihad and the force of Ba'athist totalitarianism. It's an honor to be on the other side from it. It's an honor to have as many Iraqi and Kurdish friends as I can claim who've already decided to risk their lives to do it, and for a long time were risking their lives alone, and I maintain risking them for our sakes as well. Since we're talking about our safety, our security, if we just decide to limit ourselves to that, I'd like to put a proposition to you for your consideration. There's a tendency in this discussion so far, one that I very much reprobate, and one that I find a good deal in the New York Times, to name only one newspaper, and also in the Democratic Party, to watch this outcome as if to see, I wonder how it's going to work out. I wonder if Bush is going to win, or General Abu Zaid is going to win. I wonder if the Fedayeen Saddam and their allies in Al-Qaeda are going to win. Some days it looks bad for one side, some days not so bad. Who is daring to look at this as if they were spectators? Who is then worrying about and claiming that they feel more or less secure in their own persons and homes? Who is watching this as a neutral, is what I want to inquire. This society produces and maintains an enormous number of charitable, voluntary, and non-governmental organizations. Mark and I, in our various excursions to the Balkans, for example, or in his case particularly to Haiti, have seen many cases, Kosovo is an outstanding one, where groups of this kind have made an extraordinary difference. Not just American ones, of course, but European ones too. I find it deplorable in the extreme that from the United Nations itself, which is part of the headquarters group of many of these NGOs, all the way down to the American community level, that there are not people saying, what can we do to help the people of Iraq and Kurdistan? Are we watching as spectators? How dare we do this? Why are there not people helping the women's groups of Iraq to recover and defend their liberties? Why are there no volunteers in Kurdistan to help uncover the mass graves, to help dig wells, to help repair the roads? Why are there not people? The place where I'm standing is so full of green people that you can hardly bear it sometimes. The largest wetlands in the Middle East are put to the torch by Saddam Hussein, first drained and then burned. It's the greatest ecological disaster ever registered by the United Nations. The smoke from it could be seen from the space shuttle. You had to watch it then because Saddam Hussein was in charge of it all, as he was of all those weapons that are now lying around but no longer under his control. Now you don't have to watch. You can do something about it. Or you could have waited for him to do what he did when he was leaving Kuwait, for example, and flood the entire Gulf with burning oil, destroying not just the ecosystem and the animals, but the surrounding territory. It was thought that those fires were going to take 4 years to put out, fires that were set by a madman as he was leaving the country he had desolated and profaned. Thanks to Mr. Red Adair of Texas, they were put out in 3 months. But everyone would prefer to sneer at that, wouldn't they, and say, oh, well, that's just profits for Halliburton and Bush's cronies. What must not be, and will not be by me at any rate, pardoned in this debate is any flippancy of that kind, any paranoid conspiracy theory garbage of the other kind I mentioned earlier, or any view that we have any right to regard this struggle as if it was a matter of indifference to us and we are able and willing to take bets on the outcome as affectless neutrals. Don't let that be said of any of you here tonight. Thanks.
Seven minutes, Danner.
We certainly aren't spectators. There's no question about that. I think Christopher's idea or appeal to the Greens, appeal to women's movements, appeal to NGOs here to help the Iraqis is very moving. Some of those people I saw on the way out of Baghdad. I flew out with the Red Cross, who were leaving. The United Nations left. The NGOs are gone from Iraq. They've left. They've been attacked. They've been killed. The two biggest car bombs were the Red Cross and the United Nations. All of the United Nations is gone. It's an enormous fort now, this hotel that was attacked, surrounded by sandbags, by layers of concrete barriers. It's an enormous wasteland that struck me as, I don't know, some kind of postmodern symbol for what we have become, that this is the United Nations in Iraq. So if you want to go help, you can't. Because the people who are setting these suicide bombs have a very clear strategy. They want to isolate the United States. They want to keep any allies from helping the United States. Witness the bombing of the Turkish embassy, which indeed made the decision by the Turkish government to send troops into a fiasco. That decision has now effectively been withdrawn. It's true we're not spectators. And since we are involved very directly, I'd appeal again for a clear-eyed vision of what's going on. Christopher said a moment ago that we have absolute military superiority in Iraq. This recalls a comment made over the weekend by General Ricardo Sanchez, who's the commander there, that these attacks that we've seen in recent days are strategically and operationally insignificant. That's not the case. No, the American army is not about to be brought to its knees in Iraq. But the American army is not able to fight effectively against what's happening there, against its foe there. It is simply going out on patrols, I went on a number of them, and waiting to be attacked. There's a paucity of intelligence about who these people are, where they are, what the order of battle is, what they're doing. And you know, it's very well, I think, for Christopher to say that we're not spectators. It's important to realize this isn't an argument about the war in Iraq. It's an argument about what might have been done otherwise and what the costs of this war are going to be. Not just financial costs, which are going to be enormous, not just cost in blood, which is going to be very high before we get out of there, but cost in, and this is where I agree with him, that al-Qaeda and the war in Iraq can't be separated, cost in our own, what economists call opportunity costs, in what could have been done if this unnecessary war wasn't fought. The intelligence assets, the military assets, the moving of essentially a half of the United States military into an occupation that's getting more and more messy. And finally, the creation in Iraq of what is coming to look like a failed state, a place where terrorists can enter the border at their will, where they can carry out spectacular operations that are essentially recruiting tools. These things are intended to build a movement. And by giving them a ground on which to do it and a clear front on which to face American troops and kill them at will, the Bush administration has helped in that recruiting tool. I certainly don't want to stand here and say to you that the war in Iraq is lost. What I do want to do is point out that though the Bush administration has replied to each of these series of attacks by stating, usually in the words of the president, that we are firm in Iraq. We are determined not to leave. That in fact, they have responded to each attack on the policy side by accelerating the movement to handing over security duties to Iraqis who are barely trained. They're handing them over to civil defense patrols that have 2 weeks of training. Now, does that matter? I'm not going to stand here and say we should get out of Iraq. I don't think we can get out of Iraq. But I also don't see the solution that will make the United States and everybody in this room and everyone we know and cherish more secure, safer. As time goes on there, as the attacks increase, the United States becomes less safe. The goal in Iraq is not simply to get out, but to leave a government, a situation that is stable, that doesn't threaten the country. As time goes on, it becomes more apparent that the situation before the war in Iraq was much less threatening to the United States than advocates of the war claimed, and that the situation in Iraq now is much more threatening to Americans than advocates of the war are willing to admit. And that is the simple situation we see in front of us. Yes, we have absolute military superiority. Let's see, does that phrase evoke any historical memories? I have a brother-in-law who was a Marine in Vietnam. No, Iraq is not yet Vietnam. Who was very impressed by a very conservative man, who was very impressed by that war. He always says to me, political correctness aside, that you have to remember that the guy with the feather can beat you. That is, the guerrillas on the ground can win. And if the United States withdraws from Iraq in a situation where things are getting worse, where the government is less stable, where you have neighboring countries asserting their interests, the Turks, the Iranians, increasing terrorism, a situation where al-Qaeda benefits from having training bases, attacking American troops, all of this is happening right in front of us. If that happens, and it is happening, then this war will have made us much less safe. And you have to put that on one side of the scale and put the evidence that we were threatened before on the other. And I would argue to you that that evidence, that we were threatened before, is becoming slimmer by the moment.
Time. We will now have closing remarks. The voice out of the whirlwind. Closing remarks beginning with Hitchens for 5 minutes.
I don't need 5 minutes. I'd rather get to the audience, honestly, Orville, but I suppose I should defend myself against a couple of the points made by Michael the same. A permanent threat is not the same as an imminent threat. It's much worse than an imminent threat, as a matter of fact, because it's a permanent one. And I'll just repeat and underline. All of the things, all of the destabilizing and maiming things that we are now seeing in Iraq were things we were going to see in any case. They are not the product of the removal of the Saddam Hussein regime. They are the product of the removal of the Saddam Hussein regime by a force of occupation that is enormously stronger than any other force in Iraq, an equation of force that will not change. There is no possibility of a military defeat of the United States in Iraq. Doesn't mean to say that I didn't notice when I went to interview Ambassador Bremer in his literally palatial, because it was one of Saddam's palaces, worryingly colonial and vice-regal context, that I didn't notice that Mr. Bremer took credit for two things. One, the decision to restore the rank and file and some of the officer corps of the Iraqi army, and two, the decision to have an Iraqi governing council made up of actual recognizable Iraqis and Kurds. He took credit for these two decisions, which he had only just come from negating. It was his decision to dissolve the Iraqi army and his decision to say that there shouldn't be an Iraqi governing council. There was no need for one. So I like it when civil servants wear the medals of their defeats and take credit for successes that they had actually prevented from occurring until now. And I'm not sparing of criticism of it, but at least there is an argument going on, and a course correction can be made. And there are real, live, democratic, often elected, especially in Kurdistan, Iraqis with whom this discussion can go on. And yes, it very often is much riskier to have an open society or a democracy than the relatively, but I think deceptively predictable, in fact, deadly and volatile stability of a homicidal, totalitarian, aggressive dictatorship. And here, Mark, I really must say a word. That the United States supported Saddam Hussein in his attack on Iran is well known. It was one of Jimmy Carter's great crimes, that the United States was still defending the Saddam Hussein regime when the Anfal campaign of mass murder and gassing unfolded across Kurdistan is also well known. One of the many reasons I feel that I can't desert my position in the regime change camp is this. These previous errors and crimes on the part of US administrations commit us morally, I think, and also politically, to undo the wrong that we have done. We have inherited Iraq, in effect, as a responsibility. There was no avoiding the inheritance of that responsibility. Mark only makes my point for me when he points out how gruesome and mistaken and criminal were the previous policies. Well, then the question is resolved. There's no further argument about it. We have adopted Iraq. It is our responsibility. We have now accepted as much. With that come some terrifying other considerations. But they are, unfortunately, as inescapable as the adoption and the confrontation with the tyranny were to begin with. Really all that Mark has done, it seems to me, is, apart from the fact that he's confirmed my point about the disgraceful scuttle led by the United Nations, but joined by the International Committee of the Red Cross, both of these groups, by the way, with very spotty records in the past, in fascist Europe, in the Balkans, and in Rwanda, to have helped lead and organize an abandonment, a scuttle from the Iraqi people. I don't think the United States or any of its constituent civilian and non-governmental organizations should have any part in this retreat and betrayal. To the contrary, I argue that we should all do our best to think of ways in which that scuttle can be reversed. And for the rest, it seemed to me that all of Mark's points, some of them very well made, called, as they do in Afghanistan, not for non-intervention, not for neutralism, because these two things are, I will go down repeating it, these two options do not exist. They are not on the agenda. They are not open to us. Neutralism and abstention and non-intervention were never there as options that we could take. But instead they represent his criticisms and mine, and I have more if there were time, to make the intervention more thoroughgoing, more thought out, and more, if necessary, ruthless. And all of this would have been possible if, I think, if so many of the American intelligentsia had not decided about a year ago that this argument was really none of its business and that its advice, counsel, and experience would be withheld. I think that period of neutralism and abstention has come to an end. So get ready to think what you're going to do about your own safety and also about the freedom and dignity and security of others. Internationalism is our only hope. Thank you.
Banner, 5 minutes.
A good deal, of course, of the intelligentsia, American intelligentsia, was for this war. In fact, one could make the argument that this war was given to us by the American intelligentsia, as represented by the civilian leadership in the Pentagon. This is an intellectuals' war, it seems to me. It is an idealist war, no question about it. And you're hearing some of that idealism here. The question is whether embrace of idealism and high-flown words, some of them very confusing, I must say, deadly and volatile stability. I'm not quite sure what to make of that. But embrace of idealism doesn't free us from having to look at the facts and the consequences of our actions. It's lovely to talk about the spread of democracy. It's beautiful to talk about spreading democracy across the Middle East. It sounds very good. A lot of speeches were made supporting this idea. It wasn't thought through, to make a very obvious point. The steps that would have been necessary between fighting a war for democracy and actually installing one were not thought through. The mistakes, you know, the most obvious mistakes are very clear to everybody in this room. The lack of an occupation force, the refusal to intervene in what was looting on an absolutely indescribable scale, the decision to disband the Iraqi army, and the sending over of an occupation force, a civilian occupation force, that was wholly unprepared. All these things have real consequences. Christopher argues as if the choice now is between neutralism and engagement. There's no choice. We are engaged. I'm not standing on this stage saying, pull out of Iraq, and I'm not Gore Vidal. I'm standing here saying that the blunt reality is we're in a very messy situation in which the choice is no longer democracy or fascism. The choice is stability or chaos. That is the situation which these high-flown words have put us in. Here we are. If indeed the major threat or the main threat to the United States is international terrorism, we have, by starting an intervention in Iraq that we're going to have great trouble finishing, and I mean by finishing, installing a government, transitioning to a government, whatever you want to call it, that will be stable, somehow representative, and not dramatically anti-American. If that is the necessity now, it is very unclear what path leads to that conclusion. More people are being killed there every day. I believe, after having reported there for a couple of weeks, that things are going to get worse before they get better. As I said a moment ago, we have to look at this as citizens who I believe were seriously misled about what our government was doing and about the consequences of its actions. I agree wholly with Christopher that there is no choice about imminent or instant withdrawal. I agree with him. Where we differ is the situation on the ground, the necessity for getting involved in a conflict that is costing a lot of American lives and putting all of us at increasing risk. The question, I think, in the end, is again about our citizenship. Whether we were misled by our leaders, whether we can think clearly about our security, and whether we can, in hearing the kind of words you're hearing from the other side of the stage, make judgments about the difference between rhetoric and fact. I ask you again, Christopher's animadversions aside, to read the newspaper. I ask you again to watch the news. I ask you again to think about whether what's going on in the Middle East, as a result of your government's policy are making you more or less secure, I ask you again to look at whether the high-flown words about spreading democracy represent something that's real or something that is an illusion that is fleeing before us in the face of these mortar attacks on American headquarters. It's a good thing that Christopher went to see his friend Paul Bremer a couple of months ago. If he had gone now, chances are he would have been under mortar fire. On that
Sobering.
and
Very sobering.
somehow, I don't know, somehow inspiring thought, I think I will close. Thank you.
Well, thanks to both of you. Now, those of you who would like to ask a question, please repair to the microphones in the aisles. While you're doing so, let me start with one. Is nation building possible in Iraq at this moment, given the present state of affairs? And let's try to have 1 minute answers so we can get more questions in.
Well, when I spoke last to this audience, or debated with Mark, I said that regime change had already been demonstrated in practice in northern Iraq, the area of the country that had already been liberated from Saddam Hussein in 1991. And I argued then against Bush and Scowcroft that the job should have been completed. Regime change should have been extended to Iraq, the whole of Iraq that year. We won't know what would have happened if it had been done then. Certainly it would have been better than the present status quo. But yes, in Kurdistan, which I'll remind you, is the most mountainous, in some ways the most underdeveloped part of Iraq. It's very rich in natural resources, but the Kurds have never been able to control their own resources until recently. The most clannish, the most tribal, the one with the most history of ethnic and social violence, and of course, with on top of that, the horrendous campaign of mass murder, including gassing, that rolled over the territory in the dying years of the Saddam regime. In spite of that, the Kurds have been able to produce something like a two-party system, had been able to...
Two parties who fight one another periodically.
The most impressive of the achievements of the PUK and the KDP during the period of emancipation from Saddam's rule in northern Iraq was exactly that, as I pointed out. There had been tribal and clan fighting in Kurdistan. That isn't a problem anymore to anything like the same extent. It's a remarkable difference. There are now 4 female High Court judges, for example. There are 21.
If I could intervene
Let's
just for a
hear
second.
Mark have a moment here.
You know, it makes no sense to cite Kurdistan as the example showing that Iraq can be governed democratically, because it, of course, begs the question of sectarian differences. That is the very question at the heart of whether, indeed, a federal state, can be put in place there that is democratic and liberal. Kurdistan, for all its tribal differences, is at least ethnically relatively homogeneous. So I don't find that a very convincing argument. I think it's a very difficult question to answer.
Well, the rest of Iraq, Arab Iraq, is ethnically homogeneous.
Well, excuse me, you know, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have used ethnically.
No,
the fact is that Kurdistan, citing that as an example of successful governance, doesn't really answer the question that Orville posed. And if you look at the situation on the ground, you have a governing council that is referred to by most Iraqis as the exiles. That's what they call it. It doesn't have much credibility in the street,
No,
at least I found.
No, they don't refer to
They do not have, they
They
were inserted by the Americans. Whether they can in some way preside over a transitional process supported by American guns and hiding behind concrete walls from mortar fire is a very difficult question to answer. We're essentially trying to build a democratic government under a rising tide of nationalism and anti-American feeling in which the agents of that kind of change are the Americans. And it's a paradox, the solution to which is not obvious, and I think it's getting more and more difficult. Essentially, we are identifying the democratic field as the field that America owns, which puts everybody who's against the American occupation, makes them anti-democratic.
Now, gentlemen, let me
Can I
urge...
ask the next question? Please put a question to Mark that I can answer.
We will do that. I urge brevity on our responses so we can have more questions.
Well, I just have to correct one thing, although as a matter of, really as a matter of the record. This month's chair of the Governing Council in Iraq is Jalal Talabani. He's never been in exile. He's often been a prisoner. He's often been on the run. He's been a fighter in northern Iraq for a very long time. He's a very brave man, founder of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. It's the first time there has ever been a Kurd as temporary, even temporary president of Iraq. And I think that's something to be proud of. And I was saying the conditions in Kurdistan were uniquely unpromising for nation building, and yet an enormous amount of progress had been made there, so that does constitute my
Close listeners will have noted that
Not
I
an
said
exile.
that
Let's
they
go
are
to
referred
the
to as
Governing
the
Council of the
I want to
That
get to the
Iraqis
audience here
refer to
because
them
I
as the
know
exiles.
you guys could
They
banter
do.
for eternity.
They do.
Question over here.
Yes, I wanted to broaden the question of security beyond just Iraq for a moment. Prior to this Bush administration, the primary structure of American security was in a system of organizations and alliances and treaties, many of which have now been abrogated in favor of unilateralism. So the question is, are we safer as a kind of lone ranger, unburdened by agreements with others, or are we safer as part of a more organized international system?
Would you consider this a question addressed at you, Christopher?
No, it can be put to Mark, and then I can finish it for it.
All right, Mark, why don't you
My pleasure.
commence?
You know, I think that's an excellent question, and the strategy of isolation that the guerrillas, the resistance, the opposition, whatever you'd like to call them in Iraq, have been following, that is, attack the UN, attack the Jordanian embassy, attack the Turkish embassy, the Red Cross. There's a very obvious logic to it. That logic really began with the period before the war, when the United States, in effect, isolated itself by pushing to go forward with the war on its timetable. I happen to be one who believes, Christopher disagrees with this, I think, that the United States, had it been patient, had it been willing to wait 6 months, which of course would have conflicted with the election schedule, would have been able to get international backing for a stronger policy in Iraq. I think that, you know, the broader implication of Bruce's question is about the general policy of the Bush administration, which has been supremely unilateral in the end. And I think, no, that has not made us safer. I think it has made us, in the end, less safe. And I think relations, in particular with the Europeans, have been grievously hurt. And, you know, all of the unilateral, and I'll finish, give Christopher a chance, but the unilateral urge was based on a false premise, which is that the U.S. can do it alone. The U.S. is so powerful. This is the unipolar moment. The U.S. can, in fact, because it spends more than the rest of the world combined on defense and so on, and its economy is overwhelming, can actually do all this itself. Well, it can't. It doesn't have enough money. It doesn't have enough troops. The United States doesn't have more troops in Iraq to guard the depots, for example, and all these other things. It needs more because it doesn't have them. It doesn't have them. Our army isn't big enough. And so the premise on which these policies were built was, frankly, mistaken. And absolutely, I think these policies have made us less secure. There's no question about it in my mind.
It's pure dreaming to imagine that the United States would ever have got what I wish it had been able to get, a UN consensus on this matter. We have Mr. Chirac's and Herr Schroeder's own word for it, after and before it was given to Colin Powell, that under no circumstances would they vote to implement Resolution 1441 by force, under no circumstances at all, under no provocation.
They never said that.
Yes, they did. And it is indeed, I think, self-evident that had the Bush administration not decided to raise the question of Iraq again after a long train of violated and scorned resolutions, that the subject would never have come up at all. I will say that I think that a veto by France of a Security Council resolution is a far more unilateralist thing than an American attempt to get a whole series of resolutions enforced. And I will refrain from saying what I think President Chirac's motive was in this, because I don't believe anyone doesn't know.
I'm sure the President is
It
grateful for that.
Pales by comparison to any facile remarks about Halliburton, by the way. President Chirac had built,
Before you tell
Saddam
us
Hussein
his,
a nuclear reactor knowing what he
let's
wanted
move to the next
and hadn't
question.
been paid for it.
Over here.
Yes, I'm surprised that neither of you addressed the issue that I think is the biggest reason why we may be less safe now, in the sense of there being a greater risk of a mushroom cloud in an American city, which is that if we went after what now looks like the wrong target at exactly the same time as what could have been the right target was arming in a great hurry. A year ago, Kim Jong-il probably didn't have any nuclear weapons, maybe one or two. He's, in the run-up to the war, during and since, been in a great hurry to make many more. The real threat is that he sells these to Al-Qaeda or to anyone who will provide cash for his regime, and that we have to deal with that at a time when it's less suitable. In other words, your own arguments for Saddam a while back getting less stable and worse at the same time.
Let's
is
get a
actually truer
response to
in North
that.
Korea.
I think the question.
Yeah, one of my reasons for supporting preemptive war against Saddam Hussein was so he could never get to the position that Kim Jong-il has been in actually for quite some time, for much longer than you say. He has been able to exert deterrent force on the United States. Actually, he can, with his conventional weapons, he can destroy most of South Korea. With the nuclear weapons, he could go further than that and threaten certainly Japan at the moment, and so forth. But he has to be treated with politeness and courtesy. We have to humiliate ourselves before him. I wasn't in favor of letting Saddam Hussein get to the position where he could talk to the international community in that tone of voice, especially since he was doing a brisk trade with North Korea. That's the simple answer to the question.
Mark?
However, those countries that haven't yet got that far, such as Iran, have, as I've already pointed out, taken the lesson from what happened to Saddam Hussein and are coming into compliance. I think that's enormously underestimated by those who denigrate the president.
Again, it's useful once in a while to look at the facts. The first fact is that Saddam, so far as we know, did not have a reconstituted nuclear program. Although the administration talked about it incessantly, there's been no evidence of it uncovered. Before the war, the extensive reports from the IAEA and other agencies completely quarreled with the notion that there was a nuclear program there, and indeed those reports have been borne out. That's point one. Point two is that I agree with the questioner that things in North Korea and on the Korean Peninsula have become much worse and much more threatening, partly as a result of the administration's focus on, obsession with, Iraq. Also because they have a policy that has been completely illogical up to now, which is essentially that they will not speak seriously about a non-aggression pact or any of the other things the North is demanding unless the North commits to dismantle its weapons. And as its neighbors have been telling this administration, that is not going to happen. Finally, the administration seems to be recognizing this, but it's very late in the day, and I agree with the questioner, things have gotten immeasurably worse. Finally, it gives me a chance to take up again Christopher's wholly surprising enthusiasm for the intervention by the Europeans with the Iranians. I'm very surprised that he has such faith that the Iranians have essentially given up their nuclear program in response to, as he calls them, Herr Schroeder and Monsieur Chirac. Most people in the administration seem very skeptical of that deal, and indeed, most experts seem to assume that the Iranians have accelerated their movement toward a nuclear weapon because of the Iraq war. We'll see how this hiatus, what exactly it leads to. A lot of people have thought that this deal was essentially to head off the movement of the Iranian issue to the Security Council.
Question over here. Now, sir, I saw you unsheath a great pile of papers. I hope your question is brief.
It's a magazine. I wrote it down on the back so that it would hopefully
Right,
be
well,
brief.
let's have it.
You should welcome that.
I possibly will.
Having protested Christopher last November at the Mario Savio Annual Memorial Lecture, I want to say that I welcome his participation in this lecture, even though I disagree with him.
Thank you, I suppose.
And I can express my disagreement in four-word pith. I told you so. You know, of course, the U.S. didn't go into Iraq to establish a democracy. The U.S. went into Iraq to establish someone who we, the U.S. government, would do what we said. Never in the history of
Maybe, let's just deal with that. I put a question mark at the end of that
No, let
statement.
me ask my own question.
Okay,
That hasn't even been 60 seconds.
Let's have it.
That hasn't even been 60 seconds.
Let's be brief.
Allow me equal time to ask my own question. Thank you. Never in the history of the United States has the United States government ever directly intervened, either with its military or its CIA, in a non-European, non-industrial, developing third world country for the purposes of establishing a democracy. Never. So my question is, how are those of us, in fact, quite to the contrary, my question is, how are those of us who are more skeptical of any superpowers read imperialist altruism to believe that for the first time in U.S. history, we intend to go into such a country for the purposes of establishing a democracy? Thank you.
It's very clear that there were a number of reasons behind this war. What isn't clear is which ones were predominant. The arguments for it are shifting every day according to the winds of politics and according to how the war is going in Iraq. It's clear that there were some people in the Defense Department and also to some extent the President who believed that in order to protect the United States, some kind of democratic revolution had to be started in the Middle East. Whether or not that sounds absurd, it is clear that some of them believed it. It's also clear that there were national security reasons, that the U.S. has very strong national interests in the Gulf and keeping it secure, that Saddam was thought of as a threat to those interests, and that some in the administration also believed that weapons of mass destruction were there and represented a threat to the United States. I take your point about the history of U.S. foreign policy. But there is an argument that this was a more idealistic effort than it should have been, frankly. I think this wouldn't have happened. I'm not saying this was the only reason, as I just said, but I don't think this would have happened without the true believers, many of whom are in the civilian ranks of the Defense Department, who really did believe that the attacks of 9/11 gave them a reason to respond with an ideological war. That is, a war that would change governments, change thinking, start a revolution, which is why, this is what neocons are. They're revolutionaries, lefties who've become righties, who still believe in revolution. So I don't... That doesn't, allay your skepticism in the least. I'm just saying that we will see in the next, when the going gets rough, that's when you get these kind of coalitions that start to split up. And that's what's happening in the administration now. The people who think we have to stay, we have to establish a democracy, are rubbing up against the people who think the election is coming, we have to get out. And the people who think the latter are winning, is my perception. We have to hand this over to the Iraqi security people as quickly as possible, train them, throw them into the breach. The problem I have is that the notion that this will get the United States out at minimum risk is, I think, completely wrong. I don't think that is an easy solution. I don't think that is a way to establish a stable Iraqi politics. I don't know what the way is. Nation building, Orville mentioned before, we don't know how to do that well. This notion that you can just go in and start a democracy, we don't know how, we don't know how to do that. We've intervened in many places. There are few, we occupied Haiti, we occupied the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Cuba. You can go down a long list and you see relatively few successes even after very long occupations. This is very hard, particularly after a national security regime that's wiped out all political opposition over 30 years and consisted mainly in security agencies and secret police. This is not a very fertile ground for establishing a democratic politics, and Iraq never was.
Well, if it had been, you wouldn't need to establish one, would you? I mean, let's avoid tautology where we can. Speaking for myself, I must say I'm glad that there are still some Americans who are in favor of revolution. I think it's a good thing. And the wrongness of your question, sir, goes to the half-rightness of what Mark Dana was saying about the risks and vulnerabilities on which he dwelt, I think we'll have to say, very generously with us, if we hadn't indeed been reading our New York Times or watching our CNN. Yes, there are many risks and vulnerabilities to which American forces, civilian and military, are exposed in Iraq. Why is that? Because they're not there to impose a Shah, because they're not there to impose a Pinochet. because they are there to allow the Shia pilgrimages to resume. Millions, no, hundreds of thousands of people openly cutting themselves, going into religious ecstasy for the first time in generations, because they're allowed to do so again. They're there so that the Iraqi Communist Party, which was actually the largest civilian force in the anti-Saddam resistance, now has a seat on the governing council. Paul Bremer used to be a member of Kissinger Associates. I'm willing to bet you he's the first member of Kissinger Associates ever to have invited a communist party to power in a third world country.
We'll see how generous he is if they take power.
The solution to the Fallujah problem is militarily, very simple. The United States can, if it wishes, do to Fallujah what President Hafez al-Assad did to the town of Hama. He said, this is a town that's a pain in the ass. We can make that go away. Not the pain in the ass, the town. Okay? The United States is forbidden by its policy to do this. It has to have its soldiers standing around where they can be attacked, because they're trying to help civilians to become publishers, citizens, voters, ex-prisoners, and successful searchers for their missing and tortured and murdered loved ones. You, sir, deliberately, and Mark accidentally, have both made the essential point about this whole debate.
Question here.
I hear a discordant note of agreement between Mark and Christopher, and the note of agreement seems to be that both of you seem to agree that that United States cannot retreat from its current position. It occurs to me that we have two choices. We can withdraw today, or we can continue with the mess, fighting the resistance until the home front will to support this resistance collapses, and then we withdraw. Those seem to be the only two choices. And anyway, that's my question.
Gentlemen,
elaborate on this. We can't withdraw.
In replying to his question, why don't you also make this your final summation, since time is drawing nigh here?
Yeah, it does.
I'd rather have one more question and forego the summation, I think.
Fair enough. Then why don't we have an answer to this question quickly, and we'll do one more question.
Well, it's in your hands, as I kept saying. Of course, there's a possibility of the national civic will in the United States to fight against jihadism and its totalitarian allies becoming eroded. I, for one, will not be part of this retreat, will fight against it. I hope I shall make many allies along the way. Don't imagine, however, comrade, wherever you've gone, that if you did withdraw from Iraq, that would buy you a quiet life. Anyone who thinks that really is a fool. The propaganda of bin Laden and Saddam has always been the same. And it's always fortunately led them into making lethal mistakes that cost them, I think, bin Laden his life, and Saddam Hussein his regime already. They both believed and always told their followers, the United States doesn't have a stomach for a fight. They told them this about Somalia. It's part of bin Laden's, all of his major sermons. The United States can't take casualties. It won't fight. With some of their rhetoric, they say the United States is an unsleeping empire, greedy for world domination. But to their supporters, they say, no, no, don't worry. Bin Laden even made the absurd the grandiose, ridiculous claim that defeating the Red Army in Afghanistan had been the hard part for his forces. Bringing down the evil empire of the United States would be an easy thing. I don't think any greater miscalculation has ever been made by a man who is, if he is not dead, as I believe him to be, certainly isn't where he wanted to be when he launched his insane attack. If you imagine that surrendering Iraq to the control of these people will buy you the quiet life you claim to want, and perhaps the imposing Howard Dean agenda that you hope in peacetime to enact, you are mistaken. You will be followed here, and you will be appalled at the turn of events that the jihadists and their totalitarian friends will inflict upon us, upon our friends, upon every democratic force in the Middle East, and the appalling harvest that would result. There is no possibility of surrender in this battle, and there's no possibility of evading this confrontation. I end where I began.
Well, that was very rousing. You know, the questioner is certainly right. I'm not standing here advocating immediate withdrawal. I frankly don't know what I'm advocating because I feel that the situation is very difficult in Iraq and it's going to get worse. And the problem is, as Christopher said, we have absolute military superiority. That's the problem, which is to say that these attacks are going on, they are increasing, and the United States has absolute military superiority. This is a political problem. I encountered many officers who said things like, they haven't even engaged us in anything above the squad level. You know, they were very dismissive of what was going on. The problem is that the American military isn't set up to deal with this kind of a conflict, which deals with intelligence. They're very good at armored warfare. They're very good at a lot of things. They're very smart. They have incredible technology. I mean, they're very impressive. But these people at the moment are running rings around them. The American military strategy in Iraq now is to go out on the roads and wait to be attacked. That is what the United States is doing in Iraq, and they are succeeding. You know, they are being attacked. But we're not finding these guys. We have very little intelligence on them. It's very unclear who's doing it. And the people who are doing the suicide bombings in any event seem to be very smart. So when you talk about withdrawal, you know, the problem is we're now up to our necks in Iraq. And the situation there is very unstable. It's unclear who is going to end up with political power. It's unclear what the U.S. role is going to be in helping someone to obtain political power. There is a struggle over a new political dispensation there in which the Shia, if it's democratic, should indeed have power as they never have done. And if indeed that comes to pass, it threatens neighboring states like the Saudis and others who have their own Shia minorities. There is a difficult political calculus there that the United States has not come anywhere near close to solving, or even, even having ideas to solve, as far as I can tell. Meanwhile, the security situation is getting worse. I look at this and think, well, you could withdraw, and there would be some kind of war there for power. At this point, I think what the American military is pleased to call the FRLs, the former regime loyalists, would win because they're better organized, they're better armed, they're smarter, and they've been running the country for 30 years. So they would probably win. The United States wants to hope that it can stay long enough to have a more benevolent politics evolve there. But, that is not the direction of things on the ground now. I said a moment ago that we're not very good at nation building, and I think that's true. I think it's very hard to take over a regime like this, a country that has been ruled in this way, that has tens of thousands of secret police, armed and trained, a society of fear, and to, under an American occupation, transform it. It's like trying to do work on a very intricate watch in your own shadow, It obscures the view. So I don't know the solution. I agree with Christopher that it's very difficult now to see a solution as withdrawing. And as far as next question, I'd be glad to let a few more questions happen if our moderator would agree with that.
I think you have a disagreement here. Let's do one more question, short answers, please, because it's getting quite late.
Thank you. My name is Nicholas Smith. I'm a freshman at Berkeley. And Mr. Hitchens, I heard you talk earlier about how eventually we have to attack Iraq because his administration would, I think you said, explode.
Implode.
Implode. But my question is this. What is your view on North Korea? And should we have attacked North Korea when the media exposed that they were reinstituting their nuclear programs? So I want to avoid inconsistency. And what do you think about North Korea?
Well, if the United States, shall I repeat the question? The gentleman asks me whether, given that I based part of my case for the intervention in Iraq on the impending implosion of the society, which, as Mark has yet again pointed out, was going to happen anyway and left us with very undesirable residual enemies to deal with, again making my point for me. But given this, the question I wanted to know, would I be in favor of a similar strike on North Korea? Well, if the United States was the country that some people maintain that it is, it would be quite possible for the United States to disarm North Korea, at least as a nuclear power, any time tomorrow. There's no way the North Koreans can stop their reactors from being taken out. And the best time, it's argued by some people in Washington, would be to do it now, before they fully come on stream, and before blowing them up or disabling them would lead to the spread of fissile material or a plume. And the only consequence that one could be fairly sure would happen if that precautionary measure was taken was that Kim Jong-il would use his conventional weapons to destroy the city of Seoul, which is the capital of a now large and, I'm happy to say, finally thriving democracy. Well, that's only Koreans. We'd be safer. You see, I don't think one could, in decency, advocate such a policy. So I very much caution you to consider your own safety first, or rather, to consider it in isolation from the safety, by which I also mean the freedom and the dignity of other people. But yes, it would be possible to remove Kim Jong-il and his regime very easily. In any war they started, they would lose, and that would be the end of Stalinism in North Korea. The price, in this case, might be just a very little high, but it's not our fault. It is the fault of the forces of totalitarianism and terrorism against which we are contending per force. And who is going to say that we're making the North Koreans be mean? I suppose somebody probably will.
Mark?
We brought out the beast in them.
Well, I think I've already made my views clear on North Korea. I think the administration came in with they came in with very set ideas about not continuing Clinton's policy. Clinton, in the last days in office, was about to make a visit to North Korea and had essentially reached, essentially concluded a non-aggression, a kind of pact that would have ended a lot of these problems. The Bush administration, in their policy of ABC, anything but Clinton, essentially threw that thing in the trash heap and did pretty much nothing for 2 years on the North Korea issue, except say that we would not talk to them unless they got rid of their nuclear weapons, which was not, may have been a very idealistic policy, but wasn't a very effective one. It also allowed them, as the last questioner said, to buy a number of nuclear weapons, and they're building more all the time. I don't agree with Christopher that you could take these things out. It's clear that there are several and maybe many facilities that we don't know about. We don't know the location of them. So the notion that you could simply remove them by an airstrike, I think, is mistaken. You know, there is no easy solution to what's going on in the Korean Peninsula now. And I think we should worry a little bit that there are advocates in this administration who would indeed back a preemptive strike on the North. This is a very, very ideologically extreme administration that we're living under.
And you see, you're faced with Kim Jong-il, and you say the ideological extremists are in Washington. This is surrender and advance. This is defeat in the mind.
Oh yeah, well then we should attack him, clearly. I'm sorry.
No, but he was offered nuclear reactors by Clinton, okay? Peaceful ones, supposedly, as part of a bargain to stop building nuclear weapons, and he didn't stop.
And that bargain prevented a war.
He didn't stop.
That bargain prevented a war in 1993.
And they fired without warning a test missile over Japan. That was the reward they gave for conciliation.
This is a very simplistic version.
Gentlemen, before this becomes Fox Television, I'd like to thank both Christopher Hitchens and Mark Danner, and thank all of you for coming.